Hi, and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 3, Advanced Certificate in Procurement and Supply Operations. This is Module 3, Contract Administration, and it's Learning Outcome 1, which is to know the administrative content and how key tasks are associated with commercial contracts. So we're going to look at the different types of contracts and agreements. We're going to describe the purpose of the documents that compose a contract and the stages involved in forming a contract, as well as how to develop and present a business case. So generally, for a contract to exist, 5 things are necessary. An offer, so you must have an offer for someone to say, I will sell you this for this particular price. But that offer then has to be accepted, and silence is an acceptance. You have to physically have somebody nod, shake your hand, or confirm in writing that they've accepted your offer. Those 2 things together form an agreement. But the agreement needs to be cemented, and it's firstly cemented with something called consideration, a fancy word for something of value that gets exchanged. So in essence, it needs to have something of value that goes from one party to another. So traditionally, this would be goods and services in exchange for money, but it could be goods or services in exchange for goods and services of an equal value or a similar value. Without that, it's purely a gift, because you're not exchanging anything. The 4th thing is something called intention, which means that you need to be intending to be legally bound. So if, for example, I was to sell you an item and I pass the item to you and you promise to pay me next month and you don't pay me, then you're under the understanding that I'm likely to take you to court to recover my losses because you've breached your contract. And the final thing is capacity, which isn't about space, which is what we sort of understand capacity to mean. In legally binding contracts, capacity means being of sound mind. Often, lack of capacity comes from age, because usually a child would be unable to sign a contract because their parents would have to do it for them. But it could also be through being under the influence of drink or alcohol or drugs, or maybe having a mental health disorder that means that you're not in your sound state of mind. So somebody else would make those decisions for you. Now, in the workplace, capacity within a contract, it will come down to sort of your delegated authority, but also what's written in your job description. So typically in procurement, there'll be something written in our job description that says our job is to negotiate contracts or something like that. So it's normally okay, but it wouldn't mean that anybody in the business could enter into a contract. It needs to be, part of your job description or your delegated authority. We're now going to look at the different types of contracts. So the first one is spot purchasing. This is buying goods or services that meet an immediate need. And it's used for unplanned or one-off requirements of low value or simple orders. And the key benefits of spot purchasing is it can produce financial savings, but it's by more luck than judgment. The downside is the lack of price control. The other thing to note about spot purchasing is that the buyer does not need an ongoing relationship with the supplier. Term contracts, on the other hand, are for a fixed duration with a definitive start and end date. They're used for regular ongoing requirements of goods and services like cleaning services or stationery supplies. So over the term, they're usually higher value orders. The key benefit is the buyer and supplier have got certainty of price, but also volumes, which aids financial planning. The disadvantage is, though, the buyer could be locked into a higher price if prices subsequently fall. Framework agreements. Interesting about frameworks is that they're not contracts, they're just agreements, which is kind of similar to a term contract in that it has a definitive start and end date, but it isn't a contract. It's simply an overarching umbrella agreement, which sets out terms and conditions that will apply if a contract is created underneath a framework. The reason they're referred to as umbrella agreements often is because with an umbrella, you only put it up when it rains. And the same principle applies with frameworks in that they'll sit there waiting to be used, but you only use them when you need to. So it could be for something like legal advice or something along those lines. You wouldn't necessarily have foresight of what advice you might need in the next 12 months, but you can certainly set up a framework agreement that means you can do a call-off order if you need to. So you use it when there's a regular requirement that can change slightly over time and you can't guarantee what the volumes are going to be. You can set up, for example, a panel agreement with more than one supplier, which will ensure that you get continuity of service. The benefits is all suppliers are pre-evaluated, which means it's really quick to do a call-off order, but the downside is there's no guaranteed work for the supplier. They could sit on a framework for a year and get absolutely no work at all. The call-off is an order that relates to the terms of contract or framework agreement under which it's ordered or under which it's issued. And a blanket order, or sometimes known as a limit order, is set up for a fixed period or duration for a specific project. It will set out the quantities and the prices from the outset. The advantages of a blanket order is that the buyer only has to do that job once, so the admin is reduced, and the supplier can plan their production accordingly. The downside is the buyer is committed to a certain quantity, even if it doesn't need them, so accurate forecasting is really necessary for this. We're now going to look at some of the documents that form part of the contract. So specifications are the first, and I'll often refer to specifications as being the heart of a contract. When things go wrong, it's the first place we look. And a specification will set out the detailed requirements for the goods and services or works that are being produced or procured. Two main types of specification are conformance and performance-based specifications. If we start with the performance ones first on the left-hand side, these are outcome-based specifications that are usually used on services. It focuses on what is to be achieved, but leaves quite a nice amount of scope for interpretation and innovation from the supplier. So it focuses on the outputs, says what needs to be achieved. It's the what, not the how, which gives the supplier flexibility. So you tend to get more competition in a performance-based specification. On the right-hand side, you've got the conformance or technical specification. This is the reverse. This is basically focusing on the inputs. It gives specific details of the methods, processes, and materials that need to be used. It may even identify a specific manufacturer or a component or a part number, which means the supplier is tied to that detail. Unlike performance specifications, which gives the supplier flexibility, this doesn't. And it's more often used on products, but specifically on things like pharmaceuticals, where you wouldn't want to give supplier the freedom to decide how to make that up. The next document that would form part of the contract is the key performance indicators, the KPIs. These are agreed measures that are included in the contract. Buyers should monitor suppliers' performance against them, and they should relate to the 5 rights of procurement, which is the right product, the right place, at the right price, in the right quantity, quality, and time. There are 5 stages in designing key performance indicators. The first is deciding what matters. There's no point measuring it if it doesn't matter. So decide what matters most. Then choose your measurement. It could be a pass-fail or a percentage, or it could be some qualitative stuff, so customer feedback, for example. Then third, to select the information you need to capture and decide who's going to compile that data. Often we expect the supplier to do this, but it really should be whoever's got easiest access to the data. And then do your scoring and target setting, deciding what good looks like and what's unacceptable. Occasionally there are KPIs on the buyer, not just the supplier. In terms of contract terms, these are written expressions of agreement between the buyer and supplier. They set out the extent of each party's obligations to one another. And these terms can either be expressed or implied. Expressed terms are written into the contract, so you can't argue with them. They're in black and white. Implied terms, on the other hand, are not. These are not written into the contract, but are considered to exist even though they're not spelled out in text. So your express terms would be things like your price and your specification, your model number, etc. But implied terms will cover things like health and safety regulations and other legislation like being fit for purpose. Even though it's not written, it's statute law anyway, so it's implied by statute. And then you've got general terms which form the main body of the contract, and they're not specific to a product or service that you're buying, but you may also have some specific ones that relate precisely to those goods that you're purchasing. And then you'll have general terms and conditions, often known as conditions of service or abbreviated to T's and C's, which are very precise contractual arrangements. And all companies will have their own standard set of conditions of contracts. Some of the clauses we see most commonly are things like assignment and subcontracting, which will either say it's forbidden to subcontract or you need to get permission from us in advance. There'll be a break clause, which is a specific no-fault termination clause, which allows you to terminate the contract on a no-fault basis with written notice. Some contracts might require business continuity and disaster recovery, so some obligations on the contractor to ensure they have a sort of disaster recovery plan in place. You'd expect them to have a sort of sweeping statement that says you must comply with all the laws and regulations. The term of the contract, including the start and end date. The price, which is often appended as a schedule. There sometimes is a clause called entire agreement, which essentially is a confirmation that only terms relevant to the contract between the parties are those that are stated directly in the clauses and the schedules. And this avoids the risk of implied terms and any ambiguity. So it's about whether things were said or submitted during the tender or negotiation. If it's not written into the contract, it's not part of the contract. So it's really important that both parties check that anything they're sort of relying on is written into the contract for it to be enforceable. You'll have a clause around force majeure, which is a term that we give to unforeseen events like floods, fire, and earthquakes. Sometimes people refer to this as acts of God. The legislation and jurisdiction, so which country's law applies to the contract, which is more important when you're dealing internationally. The level of insurance you expect the supplier to maintain through the duration of the contract, including their employer's liability, products and public liability, and even professional indemnity if relevant. Some will have limitations of liability in the event of a breach, and there's often a clause about the manner of carrying out services, which essentially requires the contractor to deliver the contract as defined by the service specification with what they call skill and care or skill and attention. There'll be a clause about payment terms, how invoices should be submitted and how many days the buyer has to pay. What to do in the circumstances of a termination. This is not the no-fault termination clause. This is in the case of a fault basis, so there's been a breach of some description, or it's nearing its natural end and you may need to serve notice that you don't intend to extend it. And a final bit would be around variations, so what to do if something fundamentally needed to change. How would that happen? Let's have a look at some of the other contract schedules. So pricing schedule, as I said earlier, that would be appended at the end. It sets out what stages the payments are due to be made, and they can be hourly rates, day rates, unit prices, fixed fees, lump sums. There's lots of different pricing schedules that could be appended depending on what you're buying. The specification, which we've mentioned already. The performance management framework, again, we've mentioned already, which is for KPIs. Certain contracts might have a property or a site list, like facilities type contracts. Codes of conduct you expect the workmen or colleagues to adhere to, maybe sort of, I don't know, their dress code and things like that. Method statements, more relevant to tenders, but also if you're doing anything that's got a health and safety element to it, it would be more about the method they'll use. There could even be a health and safety appendix which sets out specific rules affecting particular locations, for example, maybe asbestos related stuff. And if you're sharing data, you may also have some non-disclosure or confidentiality agreements in place, which can be either one-way or mutual. You then need to decide on the approach you're going to take, but the information you collect through any of these methods that you can see on the screen potentially can form part of the contract. So one of them is a request for information that you send in the early processes while you're still writing your specification. The information probably is going to help you to write your specification and to check that you've got enough budget. But it also helps with identifying suitable suppliers and finding out how much interest there might be in the contract. It is purely informational, but they may represent themselves in a certain way, which would lead you to taking them further through the contract period, which you can rely on as part of your sort of contract later on. Requests for quotes, it will either be quotes or tenders, not both. So a quote is a simple document expecting a simple price only response. Usually represented when there is likely to be very little variation in quality between suppliers and often used on low value goods. An ITT or a request for tender is somewhat different. It's more of a formal request for higher value or complex projects. It details more responses, which includes those method statements I mentioned on the previous slide, but also some quality submissions as well as the price. We can think of setting up a contract and its performance and completion as a sort of process or workflow. Each stage leads on to the next, and then they all happen in a specific order. You can see on the screen a particular contract document workflow and how that works. So starting with the RFI through to either the quote or tender, that's then received, evaluated, accepted, some sort of acknowledgement happens, goods are then received, invoice paid, and we reach the final stage of completion or termination. That will clearly differ if it's a term contract. I guess what we're looking at on the screen is almost implying it's a sort of spot procurement. Additional documents we might use in the contract workflow. Firstly, the tender acceptance letter, simple email or letter that's signed by someone that's got the capacity, the authority to confirm the tender has been accepted on the basis of all the terms that were sent out in the tender. An order acknowledgement is issued by the supplier to confirm that the order has been received, and it's important that you check that and make sure they're not counter-offering the terms, because that's a situation known as battle of the forms, where you've sent an order out on your terms and then they've responded with their terms. So you must check your order acknowledgements. Delivery note will come and accompany the goods that are being delivered. Should be signed by the person accepting the goods once those checks have been made. A delivery note and a goods received note are not the same thing, because a delivery note is simply just an itemised list of what's been delivered, whereas a goods received note will record the quality of that as well. An invoice is a formal request for payment from a supplier. It details what's been submitted, but it must include a short description. Remittance advice is sent by the buyer's organisation as a notification to the supplier to say that payment has been made and it's due to arrive with you in the next few days. And then a contracts register is sometimes used, more often in the public sector, I have to say, but they list all the current contracts to show, what contracts they have and when they're due to expire. And talking about contract expiry, let's talk about the ways that a contract can come to an end. There are 3 ways that a contract can come to an end. So firstly, completion. So if you've got a spot contract where you just needed a delivery of a particular one-off thing that you're never going to use again, as soon as the goods have been received, receipted, paid for, the contract has naturally been completed. It could be that it expires, which is more relevant in term contracts, because there'll be a set end date that you're working towards, and that once that date expires, the contract has ended. Like an insurance contract, you're not covered after the end date. Or it can come to an end through termination, which we've learned can be done in two ways. It can be, well, actually three ways, I suppose. Termination because it's reaching its expiry. It could be because of some kind of breach. So you've got grounds for terminating because of breach of contract. But also don't forget the break clause, which is a no-fault termination clause. It could just be that your needs and requirements have changed. Maybe what you were ordering was for a customer that's gone into administration and no longer needs it. And the final slide for this learning outcome is to look at business cases and the stages in developing the business case. So business cases are really helpful things. You wouldn't write a business case for everything. It's usually when you're trying to get your business to agree to funding a certain project, or changing the way you do something from what you do today to something new in the future. And the good thing about a business case is it makes the writer challenge their own thinking and find evidence to support their recommendations. But it also makes sure that the business's finite resources are being spent on the things that are higher priority or the ones that can give them the best return. Providing a framework against which the outcomes can be measured and an audit trail for the decision making. Within your business case, you will have an options appraisal, and it's really important that I point out business cases are before the tender happens. So you'll never see any tender analysis or anything like that in a business case. It's all pre-tender. But before you do that, you'll have looked at some options. One of the options, the most obvious thing, is what if we do nothing? So if we stay the way we are, what's the consequences of that? But then there could be a load of other options about doing it in-house, externalizing it, and if you externalizing it, you could do different contract lengths, different qualities, considering all the different options. Do we spot buy? Do we go for a term contract? What different lead times can we buy locally, internationally? There could be, 20 different options that you explore. But against every single option, you'll detail the cost and the financial impacts. The benefits, so maybe there's savings coming elsewhere, so if we do this, it will save us money over here. Considering both your direct and indirect costs. And the benefits can be direct or indirect in the sense that they could be financial, which is obviously easy, but you may also want to dig a little bit deeper and think about other sort of indirect benefits, such as reducing pollution, improving quality, anything along those lines, essentially. So your options will have your costs, your benefits, but it'll also have your risks, which one is the least risky solution. And ultimately, the bottom bit will be a recommendation that says this is what we would like you to approve. And it has to go for approval. And it will only really be approved if it's in line with the aims of the business. So you probably need to link back to a few things. One is your sort of overall strategic vision and your business plan, but also reconciling it with the RACSI model, which we learned in book 1, which stands for Regulatory Assurance, Cost, Quality, Service or Innovation. And there might be a really good reason why you're doing it. And then it will conclude with a formal recommendation setting out the proposal and requesting approval to proceed. That's the end of Module 1. Thank you.